Buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon to
Soy Manuel
everyone. My
Torres,
name is
catedrático
Manuel
de
Torres.
Ciencia
I'm a
Política de la
professor of
Universidad
political
Pablo
science
Olavide de
at
Sevilla
the Pablo de
y
Olavide
simplemente quería
University
dar
in
la
Seville.
bienvenida
I'd like to welcome
a este debate sobre inteligencia
you
artificial y
to
seguridad
this
global
discussion on
que estoy
artificial
organizando
intelligence
desde
and
la
global security.
Universidad
We're
junto con Es Global
doing it
y la
together
Embajada
with Es
de
Global,
Estados
the U.S.
Unidos de
Embassy
América en España.
in
La verdad que
Spain,
es un
and
placer
it's a
contar
pleasure
con la participación
to have
de
the
ambos y la
participation of
oportunidad
these
que se nos
two
da
entities
a los estudiantes de la universidad
and
pues de asistir a un evento que yo creo que es muy
giving the
interesante
opportunity to these university students
y además
to
pues encantado
attend this type of
de
event. I
iniciar
think it's
esta
very
colaboración con Es
interesting,
Global, que
and
hasta
I
ahora
want to
no
thank Es
habíamos hecho
Global
ninguna
for its
actividad en
collaboration.
conjunto,
We've never done
no
anything
así con la
together
Embajada
up
de
to now,
Estados
but we
Unidos, con la
have
cual
with the
ya hemos
United
tenido
States
ocasión en el pasado
Embassy.
pues de organizar muchas
We
actividades y la
have
verdad que es un
organized a lot of
privilegio
activities
pues
in the past, and it's a
contando
privilege
con la
to
colaboración y con la oportunidad que se nos da de
work
traer
together with
este y
the
otros temas
embassy
de gran
and
interés
discussing these
y
very
que
these issues of great interest.
aprovecho para
I
saludar a la
want
empresa que
to
me acompaña
also greet
en
the
esta
others
mesa,
who
¿no?
are together
Virtual,
with me at
tanto
this
a Ana Manga,
virtual
la
roundtable.
redactora
Ana
jefe de Es
Mangas,
Global, a la cual pues, le
the
voy a pasar ahora
chief
el testigo para que
editor
modere este debate,
at
como
Es
a Raquel
Global,
Jorge
and
y a
Raquel
Ivonne
Jorge,
Massakoski
and
de Estados
Ivan
Unidos, ¿no?
Masakowski from the
Y
United
aprovecho también
States.
para saludar a los
And
alumnos de la asignatura de
I'd
Política de
also
Seguridad y
like
Defensa
to greet the
en
students
esta actividad en la cual
in
hemos enclavado
in
este
the
debate
subject
y que espero bueno, que participen de manera muy activa porque estoy seguro que es un
of
tema
security and defense,
que no solo está
and
relacionado directamente con nuestra materia, sino que es de
artificial
enorme
intelligence
interés.
is
Así que bueno, eso es todo y
of great
paso la
importance and very
palabra a Ana.
related to the subject we're studying.
Bueno, bienvenidos todos.
Welcome to all of you. I'm sorry about the delay. We had some technical problems. We hope they've been resolved. And first, welcome to the students. Thank you for participating in this session on artificial intelligence and global security. I hope you find it very useful and of great interest to you for your field of study. I want to thank the Pablo de Olavide University for participating in this project, and also the United States Embassy for participating with us. It's important to be able to transfer the discussions that are sometimes held in more academic circles, to bring them closer to the average citizen, and here in this case to students. These types of fora also need to be brought to the attention of the press, and I think it's important for the upcoming future. As Manuel said, apart from being a very interesting subject, we are following this very closely in Es Global, not only in the military sense, but social, political, economic, finance, cities, urban issues. So it's a pleasure to have such an expert panel who have a lot to contribute, because I think you're going to be able to tell us what's happening, the changes that are underway, and look to the future so that we can see where the trends are pointing in the medium term. I'm going to give the floor now to Ivan Masakowski. She is a researcher of the U.S. Naval War College, and she is a member of research teams in NATO and has a long list of publications. One of them is a recent book 2 months ago. It's called Artificial Intelligence and Global Security. I'm going to give you the floor right now, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me. I'm very honored to be with you all, so good afternoon out there. And it's a pleasure to be with students, and I hope that you find this talk somewhat inspirational, so feel free to have a lot of questions for us. First, I have to say, by the rules of our organization, the U.S. Naval War College, I have to provide a disclaimer. Any of the opinions I have are personal. They are not reflective of a government policy. As Anna had mentioned, I have done a lot of NATO work in my career, over 25 years, invested in doing work that affects multinational military operations. And I've also been a researcher my entire career, as well as a professor. I currently mentor students in their dissertations at the War College on artificial intelligence. So we've covered a lot of topics on that area. I recently also gave a talk for women in big data. If you haven't heard of that organization, Google it, link into it. And there is a presentation I think I forwarded to the embassy to share with everyone. So that's the highlight of this. Today, I hope that we get to these topics, but I wanted to give you some sense of an agenda. Why is artificial intelligence important to us? Well, it affects society, as Anna was speaking to. It affects us as individuals, and it affects us from military defense. And military defense from your national programs and strategies and plans, as well as global security. And as we've seen of late, certainly things in the biosecurity for COVID data management, for logistic planning, for the issue of protecting data and weaponizing data in those terms. We think of the recent example with SolarWinds and the impact that they're still investigating. So my key issues and risks are associated with AI design, in that there are emerging threats on multiple parallel levels, and they're happening simultaneously. But there are considerations that we have to have when we work as multinational teams, such as in the NATO operations. And certainly they've been, I co-chair a panel on the COVID response from NATO, and how we're going to handle future pandemics, and how we handle the logistics and managing of the data and do some predictive analytics. In terms of the topics we're going to touch on today, I think I won't spend time on it, but when you think about the AI environment, you have to think about the benefits, the advantages and disadvantages. So for the military, because I'll speak from the military perspective, we think about weaponizing AI and weaponizing the data that's there, defending that data. It's a call to looking at designing systems. How are we designing them? Are we just building on top of the commercial market? And in that sense, are we pandering to our adversaries? Do we look at China as the source of the AI evolution? So we're facing an evolution, a revolution in AI technologies that are going to have significant consequences, as well as second and third order effects on society and individuals that we have to be concerned about. This is going to affect all aspects of life. So for the military perspective, we want to look at accelerating the decision cycle. We want to ensure the validity and trust of that data that comes to us as decision makers. That is not so easy to do. Commercial designers typically are more concerned about getting their market share, the profit. And who is driving that bus right now is China. If you've not looked at it, look at the global dominance plan that they've put forward. They intend to lead the world in AI technologies, and by 2030. They've got a very heavy investment cash-wise. Their implications for economics, geopolitical security, as well as how we're going to conduct warfare in a very subtle way in terms of getting at data as the new weapon of the future. So it's time for AI designers to facilitate ethically informed AI designs with consideration for your nation's national security, because there are implications for protecting your human rights, your civilian rights, your biodata, as well as the ethical implications for global security and how we conduct ourselves in the global security environment. So I understand we have constrained time, so I won't run on, but I think we're going to talk about how data can be used as a weapon, how AI needs to be designed with security defensive measures. I call it adaptable, anticipatory AI technologies. We have to have systems that can detect, as in SolarWinds, what's that systems that's intruded upon our AI networks. So the AI defense system has to be now embedded in the programming as it's evolved. Implications for students, if you're looking at future careers, my oh my, I'm a psychologist, and if I were starting off, I would be invested heavily in this field, because the implications for the interdisciplinary nexus between the biosciences, the physical sciences, engineering, human factors, and medicine, this is a burgeoning field. So getting training and education, and this is really critical. I'm also willing to take questions in writing post this meeting. If you want to vet them through the organizers, that would be fine with me too. So I don't want to run on. I know we have a limited time, so I will stop right there. Thank you.
Ya estoy de vuelta. Muchas gracias, Ivonne.
Thank you, Yvonne, for your
tus 5 o 7 minutos donde has hecho
5 to 7
una breve
minutes where you gave us
introducción.
a brief introduction. You mentioned some very interesting issues. Some things we'll have to come back with, the advantages and disadvantages. You talked about ethics, which I'd like to go back on that with you. What are the limits or the challenges in the legal and ethical framework with regard to the use of artificial intelligence in the armed forces? But that's for a little bit later. We're going to hear now from Raquel, who's going to, I'll give you her background. She's a specialist in emerging technologies and disruptive technologies, and she can discuss the impact on global security and on public entities in society, and talk about how we can try to manage these changes. She is doing research on this and is participating in projects with different universities and organizations on matters related to artificial intelligence, 5G, etc. I'll give the floor to her now. Thank you to Es Global, the Embassy of the United States, and the Pablo de Olavide University, and for all of you who are listening to this very interesting discussion. I'd like to speak about the artificial intelligence arms race, and then to try to demystify some points which are kind of being batted around in the communications media, but it's important to have some information on these. First, I'd like to talk about the difference between the arms race in artificial intelligence vis-a-vis the nuclear arms race. We saw this over time, the accumulation of power, but in artificial intelligence, not a matter of accumulation of amount, but rather the use of the artificial intelligence, because it has a lot of applications, as Ana mentioned, humanitarian uses, economic, financial, and hardcore security. Here we're talking about a lot of security procedures. We're talking about the arms race in artificial intelligence. Who's winning? It's not very clear because there are a lot of indicators out there. If we look at talent indicators, we'll see a different result. If we look at an indicator vis-a-vis the number of companies working on artificial intelligence, the result is different. So China and the United States are on this moving scale. And there's another issue. Artificial intelligence has a lot of different applications in the United States. Is using it to strengthen cybernetic operations. And if we look at China, they have greater advances in hypersonic weapons. If we look at Russia, in this case, it has lower capabilities in artificial intelligence, but they are mixing it with traditional warfare means. So I'd like to focus on autonomous or autonomous weapons. This has a great deal of importance in regard to global security, and both in hard security and soft security. The autonomous lethal weapons are important to take into account the different ways that they can have applications vis-a-vis drones or unmanned drones, unmanned ships, They can have to do with maritime security, outer space, enabling us to automate detection procedures, and Russia has deployed them in the war in Syria with regard to drones. First, who's responsible for the use of these automatic or robot weapons? Is it the developer, the designer, or the person who's sending it out? With regard to autonomous weapons, they can either be directed by a human being or be automatically directed, be robotized. In this regard, I think you can consider there's an international campaign called Stop Killer Robots, which working with the United Nations to try to see how international binding regulations can be developed. And in this regard, China has said that it would support the prohibition of these unmanned weapons or autonomous unmanned weapons. But there's a contradiction, and it has to do with the political economy of war. I don't want to go on too great length. I think it's going to be much more interesting to hear the questions and answer them. But I'd just like to offer the idea that here we're not only talking about hotline security, but soft security, even local security, because oftentimes we're looking at it as if it were a competition between the major powers. But we have to realize that artificial intelligence has an impact on intelligent cities and safe cities, because it's the same way you've seen in the news, they're talking about the state of surveillance in China or in sub-Saharan Africa or in other places. They're using artificial intelligence to automate public service entities. This sort of thing usually comes from countries that have a lot of rivalry. And I'd like to talk about humanitarian technologies in this regard. It's important to point out that artificial intelligence is not bad or good. It depends on how it's being used. And this is the case of soft security. And artificial intelligence can support satellites to declare emergencies and deal with emergencies. Thank you, Raquel. You've touched on many issues of interest, and we can go into it in greater depth later. I'm going to give the floor now to Manuel Torres. He is with the Pablo de Olavide University. He's a professor of political science. But apart from that, he also has very interesting publications on cyber jihad, cyber terrorism, and the impact of new technologies and disinformation. I think he's going to talk about it, and I'll give him the floor now.
Muy bien. Bueno, muchas gracias, Ana.
Thank you, Ana.
La verdad que como complemento
as an adjunct to these remarks that we've already heard, I'd like to focus on disinformation and what I consider this is one of the aspects I think we're going to see all the use of this technology to materializing, to have an ability, and people, the public doesn't really have the awareness of the importance of this in this sphere. Speaking of the future, this is risky
y no solo por nuestra incapacidad
Think
más
not
bien
only because
de
we're
anticipar
unable
qué es lo que
to
va a
be able
pasar,
to
pues como ser
predict
un
what's
horizonte
going to
corto,
happen,
sino que además cuando hablamos de
but
tecnología,
when we're
uno de
talking about
los errores más
technology,
habituales
one of
es el de
the
centrar nuestra atención en
most
un número
common things
reducido de grandes
is
avances tecnológicos que están en fase de maduración y
to
extrapolar
focus
nuestros
on
intereses y
the
nuestro comportamiento a un
developing
escenario donde se han
technologies
materializado todas esas promesas.
instead of
Resulta relativamente fácil imaginar cómo sería
well,
nuestro
it
mundo si
would be
tuviésemos vehículos
relatively
totalmente
easy to
autónomos,
consider
impresoras 3D,
how our world would be if we're
sistemas de
having
inteligencia
autonomous
artificial de propósito general. Sin embargo, el verdadero
autonomous
desafío es
vehicles
predecir cómo la irrupción de toda
and the
una
like,
serie de
but
innovaciones
we
colaterales
need
que
to
a
see
priori cuando uno solo
collateral
se antojan tan espectaculares y
innovations, which
complejas,
we don't look at as
pero que sin
perhaps
embargo
being
tienen
as
una enorme
spectacular, but they may have
para modificar el
a huge
comportamiento de las
effect
personas y cómo
on
interactúan
personal
entre ellas.
behavior and how people
Tenemos toda
interact.
una tendencia innata a proyectar nuestra imaginación hacia
We are
cambios
used to
espectaculares,
projecting
pero no
our
estar habituados
imagination
a
onto
prestarnos
spectacular
atención a
changes,
estos cambios cotidianos que tienen
but
más probabilidad
sometimes the
de ser
more
afectados por una innovación tecnológica.
daily
Un fallo de imaginación habitual es
aspects
ignorar
will
que
be
para
of
hacer
greater
previo a la
impact.
erupción de grandes innovaciones,
We need to
el
look at
desarrollo
the
tecnológico ha hecho
implications
posible
of the
fases de
major
desarrollo
innovations
menos exigentes,
and
pero que
perhaps the
pueden ser más
development of
poderosos a la hora de
technologies that
transformar
perhaps
la
are
realidad.
not as demanding but
Por
will have an
ejemplo, el
effect
terminal
on our
telefónico,
life. For example, with regard to the
si lo
telephone,
reducimos de
if
tamaño,
we make it smaller
hiperactivo que se pueda
and
transportar
enable
y además
it to be
añadimos la capacidad
transported
de un
and
ordenador,
add
una
the
cámara de fotos, un sistema de
capabilities of
geolocalización, a priori no
of
parece
a
una
camera
revolución capaz
and
de transformar
a
la historia de la
computer,
humanidad.
it doesn't
Sin
look like
embargo,
it's going to
desarrollación por parte
transform
de la
the
sociedad,
history of mankind, but
los teléfonos inteligentes se han
in
convertido, por
practice,
ejemplo, en una pieza
it is
esencial
an
para
essential
atender ámbitos tan
piece
distintos como la
that
participación
is bringing
política, el
about
comercio, el ocio, o
huge
incluso las formas que adoptan las
evolution
personas de
and
amistad,
change in
afectiva o incluso
societies
sexuales. Cuando predecimos el
at all
futuro,
levels.
no solo
If we look
tendemos a
at the
sobreestimar los efectos y
future,
la velocidad
we
del
don't
cambio tecnológico en el corto
we can't
plazo, sino que ignoramos
overestimate or
sistemáticamente el
exaggerate
poder
the
acumulativo de
effects
las
of
mejoras
change,
graduales
but we
en
need to be
tecnologías
look at
existentes,
the
las cuales
increments
pueden alcanzar un
in
punto
current
irreductible en el
technology.
que
It
casi
can
nadie estaría
affect the
afectado.
productive
En este
capabilities,
sentido, el cambio
and in this
revolucionario
regard, the revolutionary
que
change
aporta la inteligencia artificial durante los
brings
próximos años
into
es
artificial
precisamente
intelligence
cómo
over
a toda una
coming
serie
years, and
de
it's going to
tecnologías ya
have an
existentes,
impact on
al añadir
existing
una capa de mejora
technologies,
basada en
adding a
inteligencia
layer
artificial,
of
pues se
improvement
van a
based on
convertir en cosas
artificial intelligence
sustancialmente distintas
and make
y van a
things
impactar
substantially
directamente
different
en nuestras
and
vidas.
have a real
Pensemos, por
impact
ejemplo,
on
en el
our
ámbito de la
lives. For
desinformación,
example,
¿no? Que era
in the area of
aquello que le he dedicado un
disinformation,
poquito más de atención,
I think we need to
que ya forma parte de nuestra realidad, que
realize
cada
that
vez
this is
ocupa
part of
mayor
our
espacio
reality.
en
It's
la actualidad
occupying more and
informativa
more
y en
space
el ámbito de las preocupaciones que
in
todos tenemos
the
sobre
informative
cómo
world,
proteger nuestra
and
democracia y la
we
integridad
have to be
de
concerned
los
of
medios de
how to protect
comunicación
our
frente a este tipo de
democracy, the
operaciones
communications media,
maliciosas.
from
Pues
malicious
una forma de
actors.
potenciar esas
One way
operaciones de
of looking
desinformación
at
son los
these
llamados deepfakes, que cada vez son más conocidos. Es un material
disinformation activities, we
audiovisual
call
donde se
them deep
transporta de
fake,
manera creíble a una persona utilizando
using
recreaciones que se han
very
creado
credible
por ordenador a través
audiovisual
de sistemas de
means.
aprendizaje profundo. La capacidad de esta
The
tecnología para
capability, the
desarrollar un contenido
technological
manipulativo
capability
sin duda va a ser una
for
de las
manipulation
grandes innovaciones
is
en
going to
el
be one
ámbito de la
of the
persuasión en los
major
próximos años.
innovations
En la
over
actualidad,
coming
el
years.
entrenamiento de un modelo de
The
aprendizaje profundo
training
pues, es un
of
procedimiento
a
exigente en
deep
recursos. No solo por la
learning
disponibilidad de datos, sino también
device
por la
is going
disponibilidad
to
de
be
un hardware
something. There's going to
especializado
there
que
will
actualmente
be
tiene un notable coste económico para
specialized
conseguir un
hardware
resultado de calidad media.
which
Esa puede ser la razón, por ejemplo, por la que los
is
deepfakes
available. So
todavía no
the
se han hecho
deep.
ni
This is a
omnipresentes
reason, perhaps,
en el
because
ámbito
deepfake has
informativo,
not even become
como
present
muchos
in
anticipaban.
the
Pero el coste
informational world,
fecundará
but
en los
we
próximos
can
años.
expect it
Y
in
como toda
coming
innovación
years,
tecnológica,
not
ese
to
abaratamiento
the
pues,
near future.
implicará también una cierta
And there's
democratización
been
y
a
la
certain
entrada en el juego de la
democratization
desinformación
in
asistida
the
por ordenador
interplay
pues,
between
a todo tipo de
disinformation
actores.
assisted by
Pensemos, por ejemplo, que
computer
esa
and
tecnología
other
deepfake ya ha
means.
hecho su aparición en
This
aplicaciones para
has
consumidores y proyectos
been
artísticos.
found in
No sé
consumer
si recordáis
products.
como
For
una
I
app,
don't know if you
una
remember
aplicación china
a
llamada
Chinese
Zao,
application called Thao
lanzada
or
poco
Zhao,
menos de 2 años, permitía a los
launched
usuarios
2 years
poder
ago,
compartir
allowed
vídeos donde se intercambiaban los
users
rostros montados
to
sobre
share
redes de vídeo
videos based on popular series. In Spain, we have the recent popularity of this application of Face Up or Face App, where it could make your face look older or younger or change sex. The beginning of the proliferation of these technologies is going to open up exposure to different actors. But deepfake is not going to be distinguishable from reality, and the use of technologies will have a interruptive or disruptive effect in the political spheres, which are unstable. This introduces a variability of a lack of credibility. There's a trend towards calling things fake news when we're not happy with what they're saying. And if we add to that all of the mistrust of the sources and of the means themselves, what we're perceiving recently, we know that there's technology that enables this content to be implanted, then we're going to be seeing a cycle of denial of credibility, and that's going to be a destabilizing factor and cause political convulsions. This brings me to another environment, and I'll be concluding through this. We can see this happening in applications where we have some suspicions. If we have an exchange of messages, for example, on a social media, if it's a person or automated system, a bot, starts using natural language and interacting with us in a way that's indistinguishable from a real person. But taking into account that this is going to be happening in a very short time, and I can refer to the state of California, where they started to discuss a potential law, which is called the Blade Runner law. There are robots in the social media that are present themselves as another human being. So the problem here is that the environment is being created where there's going to be a dividend. There's going to be a difficulty in being able to determine the trustworthiness of information, and it'll give a lot of ammunition to people who want to call everything fake news or untrue. And they can always resort to that, that anything that harms its own interests can be called fake or untrue. So, one of the major threats for the disinformation campaigns through artificial intelligence are the ones that what could call a collapse of reality, an avalanche of images and contents that look so true that it could this will make the prediction tangible that Hannah Arendt spoke about 40 years ago, saying that if everybody is listening to lies, then it's not that everybody's going to think everything's a lie, but they're not going to believe in anything. So that the effect of disinformation is to undermine confidence in anything, and this is going to give a lot of opportunity to manipulators to reach that effect. We hope
sepamos aprovechar los
that we will
recursos
be
que
able
tenemos
to
a
use the
nuestro alcance
resources that we have at our that we have
sepamos
available
introducir ese elemento de ética
to
en el
introduce
diseño de estas
the
tecnologías,
matter of
que luego
ethics
será muy, muy
in new
necesario para
technologies,
que
which will be
reconozcamos el futuro con
necessary to be
Y
able
yo con eso
to
finalizo
face the
y
future with some
espero que
guarantees.
tengamos un
And I
coloquio
think I'll end there and then
interesante.
look forward to the colloquial, the discussion.
Muchas gracias, Manuel. También
Thank
has
you,
comentado
Manuel.
cosas
You
que sí
also
nos gustaría
discussed some things
comentar un
that
poco más, y sobre también qué se puede hacer, ¿no? Qué se puede hacer desde
things that we need to go into a little more, and what can be done in the social media, in different areas. Not, so I'm going to begin by asking some of the questions that you brought up. I'd like to ask the students, you can start sending your questions through the chat. You can start them now. If you have any type of comment that you want to make vis-a-vis the discussion here, please feel free to do so. I'd like to begin with Yvonne. You have the freedom, all of you. If I ask a question of Yvonne or Raquel or Manuel, you want to comment, feel free to comment also. This is not just too strict. Yvonne, you spoke about the advantages and risks. I'd like you to tell us to what extent this modernization process and the adaptation of the military forces into artificial intelligence that can change the shape, the face of war, and what are the challenges in the ethical field in the medium term, for example?
Well, one of the major changes it's going to have, and why the military is looking to exploit any kind of advance in AI technologies, is the fact that they can go to decentralized command. The enemy is now time in decision making, if that makes sense to anybody. So think about, in the United States, we had the World Trade Towers attacked years ago on 9/11, and they had 22 minutes to respond and make decisions. Today, you have very few minutes. So to accelerate the decision cycle, we need to decentralize. You have to go through layer upon layer of decision maker to get authorized decisions. We want to have the information that's trustworthy, and we want it faster. So this empowers the individual commander in the field to make a decision, and hopefully it's based on information that's valid and trustworthy. And I'm sure, Manuel, you spoke about this in terms of information validity, if you will. How do you verify the validity of that source? So the acceleration of the decision cycle enables us and empowers the decision maker at all levels to make more accurate, hopefully, and quicker decisions. It also helps us logistically with planning. Think of the COVID crisis and getting the vaccines to you. So we do these predictive and analytics with artificial intelligence technologies to look at what is that population that we are sampling? How valid is that population for us to plan to provide the supply of vaccine to you? So there are real societal implications and military implications.
Thank you, Yvonne. I would like to ask you also that what do you think are the main challenges in the terms of legal and ethics challenges that we are going to face in the next years regarding artificial intelligence?
Well, I think we've already seen some of those challenges. The fact that SolarWinds provides this timely example where misinformation and tools used for, if you want to say, detecting malware themselves become malicious agents within the AI network. So the mimicry of a good AI network enables an adversary to intrude upon your network that it's not being detected. So the issue becomes at the nodes. The other issue is when you bring disparate AI systems together, and let's use the medical field as an example. You have two hospitals that have totally different networks for managing biodata. But yet at some point, like for managing the AI vaccine, the COVID vaccine, you want to look at that population in order to prioritize who ought to get that. a lot of things are happening and that they're discovering because of the fact that these networks can't speak well to each other. They are not well integrated, and they don't give a true picture of how this information is going to be distributed. In the United States, we almost have a competitive medical system. And each of these hospitals, let's take a Yale or any other major hospital and a community health center, may be at odds with each other because they don't share the information. Then there's the risk to the biodata itself that's collected on the individuals. How do you preserve that privacy for the individual? So the complexities and ethical challenges go from the military level of, we can be intruded upon and not be aware of it. We're not defending ourselves a priori. We don't have the alert systems in place that help us defend the systems within the system. By the time we get to notice it, things have happened, and even tracing back to the source of that intrusion is a challenge, as they're finding in SolarWinds. They still don't know the full extent of the harm that's done. So there are ethical challenges on the military side that impact the trust kind of issues, as I generally referred to. There's the shaping of societies when we think about China and how they're using it to shape the political views. If you are in alliance with their communist policies, you are given a higher social score, which means you get access to education, apartments, you get medical benefits, you will get rewarded. Again, look at their global dominance plan, and they're reinforcing and rewarding students who go around the world to study what each nation is doing in AI, bring it back to them so they can advance it. And they've also flipped the economic lens, saying, well, for the US economy anyway, let's look at what we can provide to China to get that market share and bring our economy up to speed. So there's a lot of dangers here in controlling economics, social perspectives, cultural perspectives, and the integrity of the individual controlling their own data about their own lives. On a military level, it shapes who we think our adversaries are and how we defend against them.
Thank you, Yvonne. Raquel, quería pasar un poco contigo.
Raquel, I wanted to go on to you and the need to discuss these things with regard to education. For example, Raquel, you spoke about countries that are going advancing with regard to artificial intelligence. You talked about Russia, China, the United States. You didn't talk about any country in Europe. I'd like to ask you what's happening in Europe in this regard. Thank you for the question, for giving a little bit more time to the European Union. With regard to the European Union, it's very interesting to see how often we're looking at this narrative between China, the United States, and you have Russia, then Japan, then India, but a lot of non-European media, when you go to other countries that aren't in Europe, you realize that the European Union isn't really on the front page as much as you would think. And so it just gives you a relative importance of the EU. The European Union wants to position itself as a trustworthy partner with regard to the ethical aspects of artificial intelligence. Last year, February 2020, just right when the pandemic started up here in Europe and in Spain, an expert group was created where people from all over the European Union were working on ethical principles. It sounds a little bit like just not very important, but we have to look at it as the foundational basis, because if you're going to develop a system such as artificial intelligence, we need to be able to know what's going to happen into that black box with data processing. We have to have some minimal limits and maximal limits. And also some important aspects is to give importance to ex-ante analysis before going into it, be able to classify the process as being of high risk or low risk. If it's high risk, then it wouldn't be permitted to use the artificial intelligence, although the European Union may establish exceptions. And you can see this in the news. They're talking about how a database is being developed by Europol to be used by all of the police forces in different countries, and facial recognition on the streets, etc., natural language processing, analysis of major trends. But if the application is at low risk, it can be just a voluntary. We have to see what's going to happen in this regard. And an important thing is that is the white paper is the European data strategy, because the European Union is looking at artificial intelligence as a security asset, but it's not the first or the last aspect it's taking into account. It's just giving it a more social and economic aspect to artificial intelligence. From on a narrative level, security policy is secondary in this regard. And just to conclude, with regard, data spaces are going to be created, different for data availability. For example, the north of Spain and the north of Spain and the south of France, so that these spaces can be integrated for health data, for example. No matter how much the European Union wants to work with ethical premises, we also need protection against outside actors. For example, third countries, foreign power, to attacking our data, that would affect the management of these data. The consequences could be very dire if this were to happen. So this has to be protected. Thank you. We'll go back to that later to talk about data, the potential vulnerabilities. I'd like to ask a question of Manuel. We're talking about deep fake information. Technology is progressing. It's more and more sophisticated. It's going. It's important to be able to identify what is false or what is fake. To what extent do you think there could be a diplomatic conflict to exacerbate ethnic or religious tensions in places? You talked about a political risk that could be generated through the use of disinformation campaigns using this type of deepfake videos. And also, furthermore, beyond the technical response, the techniques to be able to dismantle these attempts, what other types of actions, educational, social, or political actions can be undertaken to prevent these situations, so that the situation you talked about, people not believing anything anymore? Thank you, Ana, for your question. I think this is one of the major issues that we have in front of us for the coming years. Previously, we were just seeing the problem from a very embryonic stage. It's developed very quickly. This technology is not cheap, but the result is more and more undistinguishable from reality, and it's opening up application, both legitimate and illegitimate. And its impact to create political effect is very clear. Many authors are surprised now that there hasn't been a sophisticated deep fake appearance in the context of an electoral campaign, but I just think it's a matter of time. this type of manipulation is being used for the first time. Of course, we can consider the society more naive and less suspicious. We need to educate society so that they can be much more careful with regard to integrating certain types of information. This question would not be of concern in advanced democracy, especially in those countries, but rather in countries with weaker information systems, with people who have less resources vis-a-vis information, and they're less able to find out whether these are legitimate informations or not. I think the potential destabilization risks are Africa and Latin America, and many of these malicious actors are using these two continents where they're going to be offered greater impunity. It's not going to be easy to fight this. When we get to this point, when there's no more individual capability to be able to determine whether it's a legitimate or illegitimate content, now we've considered obvious because we see that there's a lack of naturalness in the material. But at that point, we're going to have to be resorting to verification means such as blockchain, digital confirmation, so that it might seem it's going to be inevitable in an environment where we can consider that anything that even information that we consider makes sense are going to be perhaps deceitful. So we have to be operating in among sources that are credible and be able to keep ourselves within these sources and keep the door shut on potential manipulation. I'd like to talk about vulnerabilities. I don't know if Iván,
¿me lo puedes confirmar?
Yes.
Ahora sí, ahora ya funciona.
Well, when I think about the data itself, I think about, regardless of the domain, whether it's the military, whether it's government's strategic policies, or whether it's people's individual medical data, I think the data is data. So anything that that's tagged data, for instance, is targetable. Anything that's stackable data is hackable. Anything that is modifiable is corruptible. So vulnerable data is really the issue. And misinformation and how that information is, if you want to call it, morphed into some political construct that can shape societal thinking is quite a new kind of weapon, if you will, because shaping perspectives it's like reality by agreement. There's a psychological factor here that comes into play in the human brain, where we want to see what we want to see. We come to our belief system differently when we're not looking for verifiable sources. We sometimes subject ourselves to the mass social media and say, well, that must be our reality. So I think that vulnerabilities are countered by our independent thinking skills, being critical thinkers, investigation. Do we verify this? Do we search it out on our own? And what are those sources we look at? But the ability to think critically and evaluate information will always be the hallmark of humanity. We have to challenge our assumptions, and assumptions are often culturally defined by our experiences in the domain in which we work, whether it's in the countries in which we live. You know, our belief systems are shaped by our experience and our education as we move forward in our lives. So I think that, you know, there are vulnerabilities that are present, but that can be addressed to some extent in terms of, and it's happening now, where ethically informed designs are being created within the commercial community. In the defense community, they're working at putting in stopgaps in some of these automated systems so that there are other validation sources before, say, a weapon gets fired in an autonomous drone. So I think that there are checks and balances, but as Manuel pointed out, there are risks, and depending on the part of the world you're in and your experience and your education, how and are you enabled to and supported to be an independent critical thinker, and do you have access to information to validate what is being presented to you, are always critical elements. And we can look in history for lessons where information and propaganda were shaping societies. AI gives you is an enabler for some of this through social media, but we have the human capacity to challenge the veracity and validity of information as it's presented to us. Part of the vulnerability is the speed with which things get done, and that there may not be time to react. So that's the challenge, from that window of opportunity, sometimes depending on the level of consequences. When you think about weaponizing a system and using it in a combat operation, you may not have time to recall it and say, gee, let's abort that mission. There may not be time to do that. So I think that those are the issues. I come back to time and the ability to discern and defend against systems that are shaped with AI defense networks. That makes a huge difference from my point of view. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Ivonne, por hablar de ese terreno de vulnerabilidades en la parte de la desinformación. Raquel, quiero ahora vincularlo un poco.
Thank you, Ivonne, for talking about the vulnerabilities. And going to Raquel, you looked at that connection also, the whole issue of the military and nuclear space. What is the connection there? How can it affect, how can artificial intelligence affect this, not only in military scenarios, but also in the nuclear scenario? This is a complex question. I did a simulation of this some years ago using artificial intelligence to see whether it could alter global nuclear stability, and it was very interesting because there are different fronts involved, facets. First, if we leave an automated system in the hands, for example, maintenance of resources of minimums and maximum. If we leave this in the hands of artificial intelligence and some third party or third country actor or criminal organization, transnational criminal activity, it becomes involved. If this organization is able to manipulate the artificial intelligence system, it can make it create a false alarm, and therefore the nuclear power plant might take certain actions that we wouldn't be interested in taking. And the same thing happens when you're talking about supersonic or hypersonic weapons. Information can be stolen regarding the type of nuclear energy that's being created, but perhaps it can be changed or issue unreal data to be included. The CBMs, the idea of the OSCE is operating under a concept of cybersecurity, in that women, whatever, the countries try to share their information with a minimum or with at least some transparency, because ultimately, if we look at an example, if Russia's given a false alarm that the United States is planning an attack, and there's no other communication between the two countries, then there'll be an increase, obviously, of conflict, and that's why it's important. Confidence-building measures are important. Manuel? When you're talking about disinformation and bad actors, I'd like to ask you, how does this, we see that ideologies and extreme ideology groups, either extreme right or jihadists, we can see how they're able to move very comfortably in this whole area, including disinformation. I wanted to ask you if there are any experiences in the use of this type of videos by non-state actors or the extreme right. Has there been any research in this area, the use of these types of artificial intelligence tools? Thank you. According to the information that we have, there's been technological development on these aspects. Violent groups or terrorist groups, normally what they normally do is to suck off the new technologies, and here they've been very innovative, giving it a propaganda use. So it's not a matter of them experimenting with these types of automatic learning systems, or they're going to take the initiative. But once there is an availability of these means, I have no doubt that they will make full use of them, as they have in the past, of a series of other resources that were for very different purposes, but this type of groups can use it for their propaganda. And this is the feeling that all these groups that are working under the radar and clandestinely in cybercrime will make full use of all these types of tools for their purposes. In cybercrime, there is evidence of how some of these programs have been used. Not deep fake with regard to images, but with regard to sound, software that can modulate the human voice or imitate voices and use these voices to carry out telephone frauds. For example, if a company orders an amount of money to be paid or requires the provision of certain sensitive information, example, we have to think the worst when these types of resources are more and more available. Thank you, Manuel. Questions are coming in on all of these things that you're talking about from the students. If any of the students want to make the question orally, feel free. But right now I'm going to, from Lucia Iglesias, she says that although a pandemic may have short-term results, can artificial intelligence help for future decisions being taken in the health area? I'd like to answer this question, Ivan, with the question of artificial intelligence in health. Could it be used to predict or deal with upcoming pandemics?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, thank you for the question. I think I understand. You're asking about the impact of using AI for future pandemics, correct? I just want to be clear on the question, Anna.
Sí, correcto.
Okay.
Sí.
So when we think about the use of AI for managing future pandemics, we have many lessons learned from this one, of course. The foundation of all future analytical, kind of predictive analytics If you think of, I don't know if you've studied multiple regression analysis in your statistics classes, but doing any prediction is a constellation of factors you bring into the variables that you bring in that contribute to your prediction, as well as the weighting of each of these factors. So the validity of your prediction is based on the validity of your data. So if you take a sample data that is erroneous or misleading, your prediction is going to be inaccurate and misinformed. So you have to weigh in, where are we getting the data? Let me give you an example. When we think about the logistics of planning the distribution of vaccines, we take data, let's pretend it came from a population of senior citizens in your country. But not every senior citizen is registered for medical care. Or maybe they go to different doctors that don't share the information. So that database is not really reflective of all of society. There may be parts of the nation where people, for whatever reason, don't have access to telephones or computers, people who take public transportation. There may be people who fall through the cracks in this database, that they don't get counted, they don't get included. Then there are those who don't want to be counted, who don't want to get the vaccine, who don't want to for a variety of reasons. They could be people who have some sort of allergies or medical condition that precludes them taking this, or they're filled with anxiety about taking this, or those people who don't want to be counted and accounted for because they are not supposed to be there. They're there by illegitimate means. So the database, my point being to you, is that the data prediction, predictive analytics, yes, it can be useful. It is being used to look at how we manage this data. But there's also the issue, whether it's United States at our borders or it's any place in the world where there are borders, there is a migratory effect that shifts that population demographic that's not actually represented in that database. So in some cases, some places will have an allocation of vaccine, but they don't have the population for it. And other places have the population, but they don't have enough vaccine. So we need things that reflect the accurate data. Your prediction is only as good as the data you use and the adjustments in the weighting of each of these factors. How much of your population is a certain age at certain medical risks. It's a complicated constellation of factors that go into that predictive analytics. But at the heart of it, any good predictive analytics relies on the validity of that data. Is it accurate and truly representative of the sample for which you're making a prediction and how you manage that pandemic in the future? Does that help? Does that answer it, Anna?
Sí, sí. Sí,
yes, thank you very much. Yes, it's of great interest, especially right in the midst of this pandemic. I'm going to go on to student León Real. Aaron Leal.
Yo he preguntado al respecto del
my question is the cases we've had in YouTube using neuronal networks. And they've had a lot of, it's caused some lack of control. What type of control and supervision would you propose for people dealing with very sensitive information such as national defense information or medical information? Can you answer, Raquel?
Bueno, para las dos.
Or for the two of you. Go ahead, Ivan.
Oh, I was going to say, Raquel, I don't want to step on. If you want her to answer, I can wait.
It's fine, thank you.
Okay, well, with regard to this question, I think you, with regard to neuronal networks, we have to look for mechanisms, keeping in mind that there's a legal aspect that I'm not an expert in. I'm sure there are people who can speak better on this than I. But legal competency is not the same of looking at a YouTube video, whether it's from Spain or from Vietnam, or depending on where the video is coming from, all the control mechanisms are different. This opens the dilemma of the responsibility of the technology companies with regard to content, and furthermore, the delegation of powers by the government vis-a-vis these issues. I'm going to talk about the decision-making by technology companies. We're seeing, for example, that YouTube is a US company. That means that it abides by the principles of the United States. And now they're trying to see how to regulate the content on the social media, and using the example of YouTube, and seeing how this can be regulated. There's a problem here. It's not a problem, but more like a challenge. The communication law of the United States states that as a company, you are not responsible for the content because you're just a distributor. So this is of interest, looking at it from the US point of view, because during the last November's elections, both candidates were in favor of the elimination of this law 230, because they wanted to publish a whole lot of content, and they had to be they could be held responsible for this section 230. They were in favor of the elimination of this for their own reasons. But on the one hand, if you look at from the point of the liability of companies, to be able, corporations, to regulate their own mechanisms, but if it's a company, if they create their own mechanism, how, as a democratic society, can you be assured that there's going to be sufficient control on all platforms? The question is, then you open up the question of control by governments. The European Union, we're seeing here that first with digital systems, especially the technology, we're seeing the regulation of advertising. In the European Union, it does seem that the public powers are trying to have more of a say in these matters, but in the United States it's not the same scenario. And my question would be, my answer would be that it depends on each case, either. And I hope I've answered the question. Thank you. Thank you, Raquel. I think you responded to this challenge and how, what would be the limits and what can each stage, each entity involved. Here we have another message from another student. His question is with regard to data vulnerability. A third country can modify data in a database. In Russia, this has happened. There were recent news that Russia was manipulating data. So I don't know who of the three talked about. We're talking about data obtention and modification, and who would be this actor that was involved in these modifications? I think one of the three speakers referred to this. Ivan, you're talking about vulnerability of data. Would it be possible? Would it be possible to modify data?
I contend that it is, and I think that's what SolarWinds did. I think it gained access, and it can modify. I think that what's come of this is again, it highlights the need for the commercial designers. You see, the United States has typically, the military has typically bought the commercial product and modified it. So at the basic source code, that places a vulnerability right at the initial onset. So I think this has opened the door to looking at ways to defend the system right from the onset. So legislatively, they're looking at this, how to make sure and ensure that government design systems have no back door, if you will, so you can't go in there and modify it. But yeah, that's one of the vulnerabilities that I speak to in terms of commercial design. People want to be able to modify to improve if you're the commercial designer. That aim of, let's make sure that we can adjust this and change this, that opens the possibility of having a cyber attack and we're in a way facilitating it. So we have to legislate the requirements. From the military perspective, the services do have defense strategies in place. But again, I think that the recent attack with SolarWinds demonstrated the vulnerabilities. So yes, it's a new kind of battle space, if you will.
Thank you, Yvonne. I'd like to ask you, both Raquel and Manuel, if you think that all the governance of all these changes, is it possible to do it through multilaterally, through conversations amongst states, amongst nations, to have some minimal guidelines in place or rules of operation?
I'll speak just briefly. I think that it's being worked on by NATO. There is a group that does meet to look at these issues. However, saying that you have an agreement in place doesn't make it necessarily technologically easy. We've tried this in the past where we try to design command and control systems using to develop common situation awareness technologies, and I've worked on those for NATO. And it's a challenge when you come to the sovereignty of nations, protecting their databases. I think, Raquel, you talked a bit about this in your presentation, although my Spanish is very limited. I think the idea that from nuclear power plants and nuclear submarines have a lot in common. So I think the idea of sharing things that we consider proprietary and necessary for national sovereignty and security come in the way of that. But I'll defer to Manuel in terms of his knowledge base on information management.
What do you think, Manuel and Raquel? Well, I'll begin. I think this scenario where you're talking about a multilateral, that would be the ideal thing and desirable thing, but there are perverse incentives that make it difficult, that get in the way. It's not just a matter of the certain degree of hostility that exists amongst the different countries that deal within this type of information. It's not just a matter. It's not a matter only of the difficult relationship between Russia, the United States, the relationship of the United States with China, but there's also the fact that we're talking about technological innovation that not only has an impact on the relative power of states, and therefore they have an interest in widening the gap vis-a-vis other competitors, but it means that this can be developed in a global commercial environment or market. So there's the use of some of the achievements can provide an advantage in vis-a-vis negotiation for the rest of the terms. So the issues related to economic viability of these of this development means it goes beyond the security dimension and would require a lot more depth in the thought. And I think this is one of the main elements that comes in the way of hampering international cooperation. But we have to develop a way to to promote these types of agreements, because otherwise things are going to go downward. The powers that ultimately are more important in the exploitation of these technologies over and above the defense and security elements will be leading to the dropping of the standards. So this is really dangerous activity, and at times the countries in the European Union that might be much more in favor of guarantees will end up being left behind in the technological side of things, and have little to be able to be an active participant in the discussion.
Anna, may I add a comment?
Sí,
Yes, you have the floor.
What I would like to add is, as a proposal, and I've worked on a lot of multinational committees. I belong to the TTCP, which is another cooperative five-nation agency for the State Department. And over the years, we looked at these kind of common operational pictures, if you will. To me, there's a need to propose and fund a separate entity, a federation of nations who are concerned about global security. And in that federation, if you will, everybody has a contribution from their nation in terms of the system that they're going to contribute, but it's above and beyond the layer of what's the integral part of their defense, but a separate, if you want to call it, a security alert system that enables you to know, have you been, probed and manipulated? And that's going to take an investment. Each nation has to invest in that kind of thing. I could foresee and envisage the benefits to nations who contribute to that and who would benefit from it. But that would have to be separate and apart from things that give you access to what I call the sovereign information of a nation. So that, think of that as the orange peel around the fruit of the orange. So your orange belongs to your nation. That's your secure database. But the system that protects it, that defense network, is something owned by the federation that contributes to it and benefits from it. But that's going to take an active political will and working together multilaterally. And so I think in the future, we will come to that. How soon, I don't know, because I've worked on these things for, like I said, over 20 years. And as Manuel pointed out, there are some disadvantages and challenges, but I do think that that is achievable and can be done.
I would like to add a comment. I agree fully with Manuel and Yvonne. And referring to the GPA, it was a platform of democracies that is ethical, responsible, egalitarian, etc. If we want to multilateralize artificial intelligence, do we need to have an alliance of democracies, or should we just integrate it into UN negotiations? Right now, there's no negotiation under the UN with regard to artificial intelligence, but there are negotiations with regard to the use of space. There have been two groups, working groups. There's the Open and the Working Group, and there's a group aimed at democracies and others aimed at countries such as China and Russia. A lot of content is being created. There are very interesting negotiations going on, but there's been a lot of delay. And oftentimes, instead of creating a single group to reach agreement, there are two major blocks with a lot of content being created, but they're in opposition. So I think it would, before creating a platform, I think it would be a good idea to determine whether we need alliances between democracies and non-democracies. And I say this because here there's an important role that's played not only by China and the United States and the European Union, but also Latin America and other countries such as these. You're going to need the support of other countries, Ghana, Peru, South Africa, not only China, the United States, and the European Union. So I think it's important to multilateralize it, and it's something that we're really seeing a lack of. With regard to data governance, this is an important aspect of artificial intelligence. There's an important negotiations going on in the European Union relating to the transfer of data having to do with for economic purposes. This is being protagonized by a very small number of countries, and it really is not very representative in a multilateral sense. And there's a lot of voids. We're talking about voids, you're talking about, or vacuums, we're talking about states and companies. What can this civil society do? Does it have anything to say? How can it channel this activity or try to? I don't know, Raquel, Manuel, or Ivan, if you'd like to speak on this issue. What's the civil society, the role civil society can play in all of this?
Yvonne,
Manuel, do you want to take that?
Sí, perfecto. Go ahead.
Yes. Yes, Yvonne, go ahead. Yes, that's a good idea.
Okay. You know, I think awareness, the first step is becoming aware. I think people are not as aware as they ought to be because it does affect your individuality, your life. I think that's the first step. Second, legislatively, whether it's through political election or however, you bring these issues forward to the foreground with those that are in your nation as leaders. Third, I think what Raquel spoke about in terms of getting leaders in the UN and European Union, and there, as I said, there are other agencies, that have existed and continue to exist to look at collaborative efforts in NATO and the technical cooperation program panels. There are a lot of them that work multilaterally. I think that engaging in the conversations and getting a spokesperson like a Bill Gates to advocate for let's defend society and the privacy and the human rights, if you will, the human freedoms. There's multi-layers to this issue. This is not, just a military issue. These are the cascading consequences of advances in AI technology, down to how genetic medical treatment will be done in the future. I mean, there's all kinds of layers of information management here. But I do think it begins with getting the individual to bring it to the attention of those legislators who can carry the torch forward, if you will, on the national and international stage. I'm just a voice in the wilderness, as you guys are. And that was the reason I wrote a book about it, because there are issues that my students raised that they couldn't find any reference point at all to look up some topics. Like, how does this change just war tradition? I mean, there's serious impacts, and we are going to have impacts from the seafloor to space. We will have space wars. They will be digital, perhaps, but nonetheless, these things will impact us societally and individually. So we do have to have a voice in this, and that's how I see it. I think keep the conversation going. This kind of conversation at an academic level is really critical. So you keep the dialogue going. But I think Raquel is spot on in that you have to get the leaders of these multinational organizations to step forward and say, we really need to address this collaboratively and cooperatively, because this is all of our problems. It's not just one of our problems. Thank you.
I'd like to add just a small point, is the fact that many, for example, we have something about roads. There's a coalition. I think the question with regard to the impact of artificial intelligence on the civil society is that small ONGs are not aware, or NGOs are not aware of how their projects are affecting the users. And here we need to have reflections on ethics and on human rights. We're talking about ethical principles, on
Pero
an
al mismo tiempo, entre los
NGO
jóvenes
level,
también,
but
sí que
also
sería
the civil
importante
society
incorporar esa
should
capa de la sociedad,
incorporate
de
this
derechos
layer
primero
of
para
human
adquirir
rights
conciencia,
to
como bien
acquire
comentaba Ivonne,
awareness,
pero también sobre todo para que las
and
propias
also
organizaciones
for
sean capaces de identificar
organizations to be able to identify the problems that affect, the issues that affect the users. An NGO from Valencia is not going to be an observer at the United Nations, but it's going to receive its services, and it needs platforms, which could be the Secretary of State of non-governmental organizations. And I think, I don't know, Manuel, if you want to add
Sí, bueno,
something?
yo, vamos, comparto lo que ha
I
comentado
share what
Ivonne
Ivan
y
and
Raquel,
Raquel
y
have
creo
said.
que es totalmente
It's
imprescindible esa
important
participación de la
to have
sociedad
the
civil,
participation of the civil
porque
society.
sería muy
It would be very
insatisfactorio
unsatisfactory
este debate esté
for this
únicamente
debate to
en
be
el ámbito
only
gubernamental o de las grandes
discussing
empresas,
major, large government issues
internacionales.
and interests
Realmente hay
and
que
corporate
incentivar,
interests.
como digo, no solamente la
It's not
concienciación
only
de la sociedad, sino que
a
la
matter of
sociedad sea
awareness, but
capaz
society has to
de
be
permear
able
este debate
to
y
internalize
además
or to be able to
trasladarse
act,
a las fuerzas
permeate
políticas,
this
¿no? Porque
discussion
hablando
and act.
de la experiencia española,
In
pues
the
todos hemos
Spanish
podido ver cómo con todas las
experience, we can
cuestiones
all
relacionadas con
see
inteligencia
the
artificial
issues
no
around
forman
artificial
parte
intelligence are
del
not
debate
part of
político,
any
no
political
es
debate.
un
It's
asunto, ¿no?
not
que realmente se
a
ponga en valor
matter
cuando los
that's
partidos elaboran
being included
sus
in
programas
their
electorales.
political
Realmente
platforms.
todas las apelaciones que hay a la inteligencia
And
artificial
all of
son en términos
the
de un
issues
tren al que hay que
about
subirse, ¿no? Una movilidad,
artificial
una
intelligence is just a
innovación en
matter
ese
of
tren,
getting aboard
pero
that train
realmente es
that's coming down
una
the
discusión que se
tracks,
ve
that's
aparejada por esa
the train
agenda
of progress.
programática de las cuales estamos haciendo referencia, ¿no? Y de cómo
But we're not
gestionarla.
talking about how to
Entonces,
manage
yo
it.
creo que debe incentivarse la
So
forma de que,
there should be
la
incentives
sociedad civil a través de sindicatos,
so that the civil society, through their trade unions or associations, can be involved in the discussion, just like they are in many other areas. So we need the participation of society. We're almost at the end of our time. I'd just like to ask each of you, beginning with Ivan, to just give some few minutes of remarks with conclusions. Try to look to the future and tell us what are the key elements or major dynamics you're going to see which will determine the discussion on this issue in the future. Looking to the future. Let's begin with Yvonne.
Well, when I think about the future, I think let's make a basic assumption that there are pervasive, ubiquitous AI networks in place, and they're in every domain. So when we think about that, you have to think about looking through the lens of how does this affect you individually, as a society, and as military on a global scale, not just nationally. So we have to think about the primary effects and second and third order effects. So the primary effects we think about, well, with COVID is a great example. I keep coming back to that because there's practical application and how does this affect your health? How does it affect your community, your ability to do your job, to live your life? The second and third order effects, when I think about the security of societies, as populations increase and we have this impact of climate change, and migration is going to be even a bigger problem in 20, 30 years due to climate change, and populations are going to be migrating, and it's going to be the reshaping and reorganizing of society along layers. We see some of this already happening in terms of population management, and they'll say it's from a security perspective. We're trying to keep you safe in China. So I use that as the marker. And I have raised a question with an authoritarian regarding the fact, will we see a digital scoring happen here in America? And the answer was yes. And it'll be done by places like, when you want to go to Disneyland, they're going to have a profile of you saying, well, these are the things you do. This is your way of life. These may be your political affiliate, whatever those characteristics are, they're going to scan you on. So how does that fast forward 20 years, that lack of individuality, of having to conform to societal rules, your inability to express yourself, there's going to be a lot of consequences. There are second, third order effects of this. And then the ethical and cultural cultural differences. Ethics are culturally defined as well. So what one society, who's a collective society, will accept, individualistic nations won't accept. And by that, I mean, from a Hofstede cultural dimension point of view, when you look at societies that are collective, like, China and Japan versus United Kingdom, I'll use, and United States or Sweden, we're individualistic. So we look at the consequences to ourselves as opposed to the collective society. We're going to shift that view in years to come, I believe. So this AI is going to affect the way we shape our societies. It's going to affect our stress levels in our lives and our families and our relationships. So the idea that you have ethically informed and legally bounded rule sets for how AI systems are designed and they're going to be used in the future world are really critical. I again come back to the list of risks, which I could talk about for hours, which I won't, but you have to think about the risks a priori before you design the system. And that's every designer's problem. We have to think about the self-defense of the AI network so that they defend themselves from intrusions, especially networks that they're not developed in sync. They're not developed with the idea of communicating with each other, and all of a sudden they're being put together to achieve some end. I think we have to give consideration to the long-term consequences of how we're going to control and manage AI systems. And by that, I mean, right now we think about, well, if I'm a hospital, I control the database for my hospital. I have the content information. If I'm a university, I control the database for my students' information that's private. But in the future, who's going to control this vast database? Who's going to control the weapon systems of the future? Who's going to make the decisions and manipulate and modify the original strategic network structure of these things? Those are the kinds of risks on a much higher level 20, 30 years out. I think of us as pioneers in that we're treading up a thorny path, that we're just leading our way along here and stumbling and learning lessons based on how we messed up, as opposed to charting the course and saying, this is the route we've got to take. So I think coming back to the idea of a federation of nations coming together, whether it's under a UN umbrella or some other umbrella, but people who are in authoritarian positions have to come up with this is the framework of the future, and they have to invest in it and continually stay engaged with it, because this is a global problem. We only have one planet here, and we're trying to preserve the security of the planet and of each individual that's on it. So that's my summary.
Thank you. Thank you, Bon. Raquel, tu turno, si quieres.
Vale, perfecto. Bueno, primero de todo,
First, I'd like to thank thank you for organizing this session. First, I'd like to talk about one thing having to do with content. The other is not to do so much with content. But first, I think one of the greatest needs and one of the greatest challenges that we're going to have is that we need to be working for effective artificial intelligence and responsible AI, and have abilities to deal with it. In Taiwan, they have a minister for digitalization. There are ministries around the world which are dealing with these issues. We have to be techno-realists and think that digitalization involves a major highway of matters, and it's from technology to the non-technology, and how the technology affects society and the environment. And I think that this gives us the opportunity to deal with all of these challenges. And with regard to the container, I think that this is related to being a techno-realist. We don't have to look on artificial intelligence as either being bad or good. It has to be considered something new, that it's often going too fast for us to completely understand what's going on. But in that regard, it's important to look at it in our own homes, informing our families about artificial intelligence and informing them about the security concerns and remedies. And there also should be a communicative effort made in this regard. This is not only having to do with economic competence, but we see this in Europe. We're still lacking people with technological capabilities for European development. And we should look at capabilities and training. Manuel? Thank you. Now, just to conclude, I'd like to reiterate my appreciation to Es Global and the United States Embassy for this opportunity given to the university to host this discussion and have these excellent speakers, Ivan and Raquel. I'd just like to add to everything that all my colleagues have been discussing. I think one of the major challenges in coming years is not so much incentivizing innovation. I think that's going to happen anyway, and we're going to be experiencing exponential growth. But rather, the issue will be how to accelerate our reaction and our integration. And how are we going to assume all of the social changes that are going to be happening? Looking behind us, all of the major changes, if we look at legislation, it always comes afterwards when we're already subject to the effects. But here, there's a special challenge because since the rhythm of the pace of change has been accelerated, but also we have to try to foresee our response so that it won't be too late, or anticipate our response so that it won't be too late to see the potentials in electoral processes and possible interference. Perhaps we might be pessimistic if we look around and we see no country has introduced any safeguard into their legislation vis-a-vis to prevent any type of interference. But we should not forego this objective. And therefore, we have the need to involve civil society, because if we don't adapt our regulatory framework to the changes we're going to see, the problem will be to manage the change when we see the effects. And we'll just be trying to minimize the effects rather than to solve the problems. So there's a lot of work to be done by government and by society itself. Thank you to the three of you for sharing with us your reflections this afternoon. I think we've discussed a very key subject, and it would give rise to another full debate on this subject. Before we close, I'd like to remind the students that, as you know, this Defense and Me project has two parts. One is related to the event that we have just hosted this afternoon, but then there's a competition. We want to encourage you to participate by sending an article or a video where you talking about the things that we've talked about this afternoon. By the deadline, which is about 3 weeks from now, we'll let you know the specific deadline. And there's the prize will be offered to each university participating, and it's a trip to Brussels to meet with people in NATO and with other security and defense institutions So we're looking forward to receiving your articles or videos. I'd like to give my thanks to the participants, the organization, to the translator who's been changing from Spanish to English. Thank you. And we'll look forward to seeing you at the next session. Good afternoon.